Chapter 22. So they did know. Colin balanced on the balls of his feet even though there would be no physical fight involving these two 70-something wers. But he wouldn't mind fighting someone if he only knew who deserved the blame for this cock-up. He'd like to make George the culprit, but from the way Edwina had looked at Luna there was no villain. Edwina would have recognized Luna as the reincarnation of Sophie no matter when and where they'd met. George might have planted the idea, but this mess had been created more than 27 years ago. Edwina's face nearly matched the white exterior of her house, and she looked a little unsteady on her feet. Colin stepped forward, drawing Luna with him, and cupped his free hand under Edwina's elbow. Maybe it would be best if we could all sit down, he murmured. Yes, Edwina said faintly. Yes, it would. Jacques stumbled backward, and Colin hoped he wouldn't have to hold him up, too, because he was running out of hands. He'd promised Luna he'd keep his connection with her, and she'd maintained a death grip on him that might leave a mark. Fortunately, Jacques got his feet under him and led the way down a hallway with floorboards so highly polished that Colin worried about everyone's footing. The hall was wide enough for him to walk between the two female wers, with one hand locked through Luna's fingers, and the other supporting a wobbly Edwina. Colin felt like the conduit between two sparking batteries. Either one could short out at any second. Now that Jacques was moving, he looked taller and more in command. His stride was firm, his shoulders back. Once, when he ran a hand over his thinning hair, Colin detected a slight tremble, but that was to be expected. These two wers had just met their dead son's child, one they'd had no idea existed before. Jacques reached the end of the hall and turned left into a sunroom furnished in cheerful yellow and white. Colin thought it was a fine place to settle these jumpy people and bring peace to all concerned. He hoped it worked out that way. You three sit there. Jacques waved them to a plump couch as if he assumed they'd all stay connected like Tinker Toys. I'll tell Bethany to bring us. He paused and peered at them through his bifocals. What would you all like? Vodka, Edwina said. Jacques blinked. Vodka. She waved a hand at him. You know, screwdrivers. Vodka and orange juice. Have Bethany mix up a big batch. But, dearest, it's 11 in the morning. Jacques gave her a tentative smile. I don't give a good goddamn what time it is, Jacques. Byron's daughter just arrived. That calls for something stronger than iced tea, don't you think? Colin glanced over at Luna and she widened her eyes at him as if to ask what the hell? He gave a little shrug. For now, he'd be the filling in the sandwich. He prayed he wouldn't have to be the referee. Edwina leaned forward so Colin leaned back, allowing her to look at her granddaughter. Luna, is it? Luna edged forward a little and peered around Colin at her grandmother. Luna. This be Reynaud. Although they never married, my mother took Byron's name. She told me he was my father. But that's all she told me. She didn't say he was were? Edwina flung the question as an accusation. Luna tensed. Why would she? She didn't know which I would be, were or human. And which are you? Edwina's voice shook. I'm were, Luna said quietly. But I'm a half-breed. Edwina sank back against the cushions. Byron's child, she muttered almost as if speaking to herself. Byron's child. Then she popped back up to stare at Luna. Change places with this fellow so I can have a better look at you. Colin glanced at Luna, who nodded. He stood and she scooted over next to Edwina. When he sat down again, Luna reached for his other hand. He offered it freely. She could mangle that one too if she needed to. Edwina adjusted her position, turning her body slightly so she could study. Luna, you have his chin, which was like mine. Pull back your hair. Colin expected Luna to start objecting to this series of commands, but she pulled her hair back as instructed. You have his ears too. Edwina's voice caught. He had the most beautiful ears, just like Jacques. Jacques bustled back into the room. What's this about my ears? Luna has Byron's ears, which are your ears too, Edwina said. Jacques edged closer and crouched down to gaze at Luna. Huh, so she does. He looked Luna up and down, but then his attention returned to her feet. And Byron's toes. Toes. Luna lifted her feet off the floor. The sandals she wore displayed toes painted with pink nail polish. Edwina leaned over to examine Luna's toes. You are so right, Jacques. Her Second toe is bigger than her first toe, like mine and like Byron had. She pulled off one of her low-heeled shoes. Damn, I'm wearing pantyhose. You can't see as well, but my second toe is longer, Luna, just like yours. You'll have to take my word for it. I believe y'all, Luna said. Did you hear that, Jacques? She talks just like Sophie did. I swear it's like Sophie walked in here, except for the ears and the chin and the toes. Whatever Colin had expected out of this meeting, it hadn't been a comparison of ears and chins and toes. He'd prepared for wailing and gnashing of teeth, icy coldness, cutting remarks, not a discussion of body parts. Bethany, a plump redhead, arrived with a tray of drinks and a pitcher for refilling once the first round was gone. Good morning, everyone. I understand we have an honored visitor. She picked up 2 goblets and handed one to Edwina and one to Luna. Welcome, Luna Reynaud. Thank you. What an exciting day. Bethany took the second pair of goblets and gave the first one to Colin. Isn't it amazing? Yes, it is, Colin said, and surprisingly calm, all things considered. I can't believe our granddaughter is sitting here, Jacques said in a bewildered voice as he accepted a goblet from Bethany. Risen from the dead. Edwina took a hefty swallow of her screwdriver. No, dearest, that's not quite true, Jacques said. She was always alive. We just didn't know about her. That's a big difference. Edwina flapped her hand dismissively. Whatever. The question is, where is this Sophie person? Colin winced, expecting a heated response from Luna. He guessed wrong, though. Her voice was gentle as she turned to her grandmother. She died when I was 8, Mrs. Reynaud. But I can tell y'all without a shadow of a doubt that she was true to your son. I didn't know she was pregnant, so I didn't realize they'd made it, Edwina said. But now it's obvious they did. Yes. Luna's voice was husky. They were truly mated. Yet she left. She was human, Mrs. Reynaud, in every sense of that word. She told me she didn't belong here, so I guess she couldn't accept living in a community of worse. But she was in love with Byron Reynaud, her mate, to the end. Colin squeezed Luna's hand. Nicely done, lass. He wished they could communicate telepathically, but he thought she got the message. Well. Edwina patted the arm of the sofa and stared off into space. Well. No one said anything for a while, as if each of them wanted to give Edwina a chance to collect herself. Finally she cleared her throat and raised her glass to the startling discovery of our granddaughter, Luna Thisbe Reynaud. Although I can't say I approve of that middle name, we might have to do something about that. Anyway, cheers. Cheers, everyone chorused and took a sip from their goblets. Following the toast, Edwina leaned forward to scrutinize Colin. And what have you to do with all this? Our secretary said you were a laird of something or other. Glenbugle or some such. Glenbarra, a small village north of Glasgow. Never heard of it, but that doesn't matter. George called this morning, but I confess once he started talking about Luna and how she might be Byron's daughter, I lost track of everything else. So why are you here? I'm Geraldine and Harry Whittier's nephew. She left Whittier House to me. Oh. Edwina put a hand to her chest and almost spilled her drink. That's where Byron used to work as a teenager. He loved it out there. He didn't see much of the Whittiers, but he was very close to the groundskeeper. If memory serves, his name was Hector. Hector's still the groundskeeper, Colin said. At least for now. Luna and I plan to open the house as an exclusive inn for Wers, and I'm not sure how Hector will adapt to that. He likes a more secluded environment. Edwina nodded. That's because he never got over losing his mate, Althea. Knew Althea better than I knew Hector. We were in school together. When Byron started working out there, I told him about Althea dying soon after she and Hector were mated, and how Hector became something of a hermit. Byron treated everyone with compassion, but he gave extra consideration to Hector. Edwina took another long swallow of her screwdriver. God, I still missed that son of mine so much. Jacques came over to lay a hand on her shoulder. We all do, Ed. She glanced up at him. Not all, Jacques. This laird never laid eyes on Byron, and obviously Luna didn't have the chance to know her father. She turned to Luna. But you would have loved him. I'm sure. Luna sounded very subdued, and she'd barely touched her drink. I wonder if Hector remembers him. He didn't react to my last name at all. That was a long time ago. although it hurts to think that anyone would forget. Byron Hector might have by now. Or maybe he'd recall the first name but not the last. He's had lots of teenagers working for him over the years, I'm sure. They run together after a while. Jacques looked more animated than he had since they arrived. We should talk to him and show him a picture. I'd love to pay a visit to that island. Byron said he felt more at home there than anywhere. Luna glanced up eagerly. He did. Oh yes, and it made perfect sense. He was never a city boy. He loved the woods and the sea. Watching a pod of orcas play along the shore was his idea of heaven. Luna made a small sound deep in her throat, one that Colin didn't think anyone noticed but him. But he could imagine the intensity of her reaction to all of this. She might look like Sophie, but in so many ways she was her father's daughter. He sensed that she was on emotional overload. The Reynauds had been different than he'd expected, but welcoming in their own way. It was more than he could have hoped for. Yet Luna might need time to process what she'd discovered so far. He turned to Edwina. Thank you for agreeing to meet with us, but we have a helicopter to catch and I'll be leaving for Scotland tomorrow, so there are plenty of loose ends to tie up before then. We should probably get going. Next to him, Luna sagged in relief. He'd made the right call. Jacques frowned. But there was something about a benefit for the Foundation, wasn't there? Yes. Luna straightened. I'm managing the inn because Colin will be in Scotland a good bit of the time. I considered setting up opening weekend as a benefit for the Byron Reynaud Foundation if you would agree. Jacques nodded enthusiastically. I think that's a very problematic idea, Edwina finished for him. It's not your fault, Luna, but some of the older Wers in the Trevelyan pack remember the circumstances of Byron's death. If they discover Sophie was pregnant when she left, well, they might not be happy to support her daughter's enterprise. That was Colin's cue to get Luna the hell out of there before things got ugly. He stood and drew her up with him. Maybe involving the Foundation isn't such a wonderful idea. As owner of the inn, I won't advocate anything that would make my manager uncomfortable. We need to talk about this some more, Jacques said. Let us digest everything. Take stock, as it were. And talk to George, Edwina added. He's been one of our chief advisors for the Foundation. I'm sure he'll have some good advice. Now Colin knew they really needed to leave. We'll be in touch, he said. Luna, the cab is waiting. Edwina stood. Before you go, Luna, let me take another good look at you. Turn loose of this Colin person for 1 minute. I swear you two act the way Sophie and Byron did, like you can't bear to be parted. Luna released his hand as if his touch had burned her. Colin is only a friend, Mrs. Reynaud. I was nervous about coming here and he's been a steadying influence. Edwina looked from Colin to Luna and back at Colin again. If you say so. That's not what I see, and I haven't lived on this earth for 76 years without learning a thing or two about mutual attraction. Colin's gut clenched. He hoped Edwina was wrong about the depth of their involvement, both for Luna's sake and his own. Edwina took Luna by the shoulders and gazed intently into her eyes. You are Reynaud. She gave Luna a quick, awkward hug. So you must stop calling me Mrs. Reynaud and call me grandmother. Now go before I start blubbering like a fool. Same for me. Jacques hurried over and gave Luna a pat on the back. I mean, don't call me grandmother, but call me grandpa. I rather like the sound of grandpa. Okay, I'll do that. Luna's voice was suspiciously thick. We'll see you again, Jacques said. Yes. She gave a short cough. Yes, you will. Thanks for everything, Colin said as he recaptured Luna's hand. To hell with what Edwina might think of him doing that. He needed to guide her out of there before she broke down. She would hate that. The hallway seemed endless, but at last they were in the open air. Oh, Colin. She put a hand to her mouth and her green eyes filled with tears. Come on. He slid his arm around her waist. Let's get in the cab. I don't know if I'm up to this. It's so emotional. He urged her toward the cab, where the driver had the back door open and the motor running. I know, but it wasn't bad for a first meeting. No, she was quivering. I guess not. George may complicate things. Yes. Bloody hell, I wish I didn't have to leave. So do I. She wrapped her arm around his waist and hugged him back before she climbed into the cab. So do I. Once they were safely inside the cab and on their way, Colin called Knox and told him they'd be a little late. Luna couldn't imagine what she'd do without Colin to handle the details right now. Her mind was reeling with discussions of ears, toes, chins, and whether or not her newly discovered grandparents would support her in the long run. The jury was still out on that one. Colin disconnected his call to Knox and put his arm around her again. Look at this way. They didn't reject you. No, and they didn't trash my mother. The closest Edwina came was when she called her this Sophie person. I think that's her way. She called me this Colin person. Luna rested her head on his shoulder and relished the solid feel of him. They were blindsided by this. I've had years to imagine what it would be like to meet my grandparents, and they didn't know I existed. I think they're going to come to love the idea of having a granddaughter with Byron's chin, ears, and toes. She sighed. This is going to sound dopey, but I adored that part. Nobody's ever looked at me and said you have his ears. It made me feel connected in a way I haven't been since my mother died. What about your other grandmother? She never carried on like that. I was illegitimate in her eyes, and that's all she saw. I can only imagine how she would have reacted if she'd learned how truly different I am. With a murmur of sympathy, Colin reached over and stroked her hair. Luna sighed. She's lost to me and I'm lost to her. But these two we just met, he said as he continued to stroke her hair. They have possibilities. But will they become a tool of the manipulative George? Colin hesitated. Give it to me straight, please. I'll have to handle this after you're gone. I'm afraid he's going to try. If Edwina thinks he's some kind of business guru and he tells her you need him on this project, she'll push for you to involve him in some way. And if I resist, that will be a bone of contention with my newly minted grandmother. She looked up at him. Tell me again why you think I need family in my life. It has to do with the ears and the toes. She laughed, the first time she'd felt like doing that since before they'd stepped into her grandparents' house. I'm going to cling to that discussion, because it was the truly real part of going there. There were other real parts, like when you told Edwina that your mother had been true to your father. Yes. Luna snuggled closer. That got to her, and I'm glad because it's true. All the discussions you and I have had about those who are truly mated have convinced me that my parents were, but going to live in that world was too frightening for my mother. She paused. Or maybe it was the scary prospect of having Edwina as a mother-in-law. Personally, I think Edwina has a soft, squishy center that she does her best to hide. I'll bet you'll discover she's more of a pushover than you think the next time you visit. Luna shuddered. I'm not sure how soon I'll be up for another visit. Without you to bolster my courage, I may put it off for a very long time. Don't. Colin kissed the top of her head. They need you and you need them. And I just had a great idea. They're family, so why don't you dedicate Geraldine's room as their private suite? Let them come there free of charge, whenever they want to. Do I dare do that? The idea both thrilled and terrified her. But it would be something she could give to her grandparents, and she wanted to be able to give them something special. I don't see why you shouldn't, Colin said. It's probably the premier room in the whole castle. We could get a small fortune for that room. Money isn't everything, lass. If it pleases you to do that for them, by all means do. I can guarantee that Geraldine would have approved. Turning in the seat, she lifted her face to his and kissed him. You're the best. The best what? She grinned. You have too many talents to name, my much honored Laird of Glenbarra. You could try. I will, I promise. While we're sitting in that new hot tub late tonight, I'll do my best to list every single one. Chapter 23. Knox seemed especially cheerful when they walked out on the roof of the Trevelyan building, ready to climb into the helicopter. Luna wasn't sure why. He was being so nice considering how they'd messed with his schedule. She thanked him for being so incredibly patient with all their last-minute changes to their plans. No worries. Knox got them settled into the helicopter in the same order as before, with Colin in the back and Luna in the front passenger seat. He glanced over at her before putting on his headset. My dad says you and I are practically kissing cousins. I didn't know that. Luna stared at him as anxiety twisted in her gut. George had been busy. What did your father say exactly? Knox gave her his typical uncomplicated grin. That you are the newly Discovered granddaughter of my great-aunt Edwina and great-uncle Jacques. My dad's really excited about this in your opening. He wants to keep it all in. The family. What family? The Trevelyan family, of course. You're officially part of the pack now, and that means you get the full support of my father and his cronies. He's ready to back you 100%. I think it's exciting. With the noise of the rotors, Luna doubted that Colin heard any of that, but her stomach churned right along with the rotors. George was slick, all right. He'd try to sweep her right into the Trevelyan net, and he wasn't above using her grandparents as bait. But there was one major problem with that plan. She didn't own the inn. Colin MacDowell, Laird of Glenbarra, owned it, and he had no intention of turning control over to George and the Trevelyan pack. But as she thought of that, her blood ran cold. George had so much power in the area that if he decided to boycott the inn, because she and Colin wouldn't let him have a controlling interest, he might be able to shut them down. Eventually she hoped to draw guests from all over the country, but initially she'd depend on local traffic to keep the inn profitable. In fact, she'd planned on making local traffic her mainstay. George could indeed ruin everything, and if he had the lust for control that Colin seemed to think he had, he might be ruthless in trying to get what he wanted. Driving Whittier House into bankruptcy would mean that he'd eventually get it after all. Knox, bless his heart, saw only the lovely family connection now that Luna was going to manage Whittier House. He knew that she and Colin were involved, so he might even think that made Colin an honorary member of the pack. She hated to disillusion Knox, so she said nothing. But the flight back to Loufloret wasn't quite as filled with wonder as the flight to Seattle had been. All the way back she was in a mental wrestling match with all the complications that had popped up. When she'd first thought of opening Whittier House as an inn, it had seemed like such a simple plan. Now, whether she wanted to be or not, she was enmeshed in pack politics. She thought about something Colin had said not long ago. He told her that maybe she wasn't meant to hide herself away on the island, that maybe she was meant for greater things. She hoped that didn't include taking on George Trevelyan. The helicopter landed on the island only minutes ahead of the motor launch, bringing the new hot tub and the prefabricated redwood decking that would surround it. The dealership had hired a boat big enough to accommodate a forklift, and Luna, Colin, and Hector all supervised the work crew as they brought the hot tub and the deck materials up from the dock and began installing everything on the bluff overlooking Happy Hour Beach. Luna realized that she still hadn't told Hector about the plan for the inn, and either she or Colin needed to inform him. With a hot tub arriving, he might suspect that something was afoot. That could explain why he spent so much time grumbling during the installation. Plain foolishness if you ask me, he said to no one in particular. Who needs to climb into hot water when they're outdoors? You won't catch me in this thing. Colin stood back to admire the way the hot tub looked with the redwood deck. Added, it's supposed to be good for arthritis, Hector. So is using a shovel and a pair of hedge trimmers. Keeps a body nimble. Don't need a damn tub for that. And what about critters getting into it? We bought a cover too, Luna said. In fact, it will be covered a good part of the winter. It's more for summer use. Then I don't see the point of it. There are plenty of other things to do in the summer besides sit in a giant bathtub staring at each other. Before hearing the story of Hector's lost mate, Luna might have been irritated by his rant, but now she was less so, although she thought it was a terrible shame that Hector's life had ended when his lover died and he'd chosen to nurse his misery for so long. When the hot tub was almost installed, complete with the buried electric cable required to run power out to it, Luna decided the time had come to fill Hector in on what was about to happen at Whittier House. Yes, she could ask Colin to tell him and Colin would do it, but she was the manager. She might as well get used to managing. She touched Hector on the shoulder. Could I talk to y'all for a minute? Guess so. He looked wary. Let's go over to that bench and sit down. It's been a long day. Look, if you think I'm so old that I need a bench to hold me up, then I need the bench. You're free to stand. She marched over there and hoped he'd follow. She chose a spot at one end of the backless stone bench so that he had plenty of room to sit and still avoid her. He ambled over and sat on the opposite end of the bench. She gazed at him and tried to imagine him as a young were in love. Nope, couldn't do it. 50 years of unhappiness had stamped him with a face that didn't inspire her to think of gentleness and compassion. and yet he was a link to her father. I realize y'all never warmed to me, she said. Don't think about you one way or another. Just do my job. Colin said you thought I was hiding something. His head whipped around toward her. That was a private discussion. He shouldn't have. I was hiding something, Hector. Under his bushy white eyebrows, his eyes widened. I knew it. But before I tell you my secrets, and I will tell you, I want to ask if you remember a teenager who worked for you named Byron. It would have been almost 30 years ago. Hector rubbed a hand over his shock of white hair, displacing it even more. Byron, do you know his last name? Reynaud. He stared at her as comprehension slowly dawned. That's why your name sounded so familiar. I knew I'd heard it somewhere before. Yeah, now it's coming back to me. I remember Byron Reynaud. Tall, gangly, earnest. Nice kid. Luna's heart ached for the person she would never know. The next time she visited Edwina and Jacques, she'd ask to see baby pictures, sports trophies, school essays, anything they'd saved. She was suddenly hungry for any little detail. So he was a good worker, she asked. Yes, he was. Better than most. Certainly better than that stuffed shirt. George Trevelyan. Can't believe how well he's done, all things considered. George worked for you? Only for a couple of weeks, when both George and Byron were around 18. George wanted to be in charge, which didn't sit well with me, but that wasn't the only problem. He was always trying to outdo his cousin Byron, and when he couldn't, he'd pick fights with him. I had to let George go. I don't think George has changed. He's still very competitive. Most don't change, not really. Hector shook his head. George was a hothead. And Byron wore his heart on his sleeve. Got killed in a car wreck on his way to stop his sweetheart from leaving town. If I remember right, she was human. So he should have just let her go. No matter how many times she heard it, the story always broke Luna's heart all over again. Hector, she was human. She was also my mother. Byron was my father. He stared at her dumbstruck. Oh hell. I'm sorry, Luna. I truly am. Is your mother still alive? She died when I was 8. He shook his head. That's pitiful. Then something seemed to occur to him. Does that mean that I'm half were, half human? He peered at her. I've never met a mixed breed before. His response was so openly curious that she couldn't be offended. Neither have I, except for me. I felt like some kind of freak, and I'd planned to keep it a secret forever. But you're telling me? He scooted closer. Listen, I won't say anything. But I think keeping it quiet is a good idea. He tilted his head toward where Colin supervised the cleanup of the hot tub installation. Don't tell him I said so, but Colin is a bit prejudiced. I know. She glanced over at Colin, who stood with his broad back to her and his feet braced apart as he watched to make sure the job was finished correctly. His air of command was obvious even from this distance. He was the most gorgeous prejudice where she could imagine. But her heart warmed toward Hector for the first time since she'd arrived at Whittier House. She'd told him her big secret, and instead of trying to use it against her, he was willing to help her keep it. It's kind of y'all to warn me. I wouldn't want him to give you the sack. I appreciate that. But Colin knows, and he's letting me stay on. In fact, he's agreed to let me manage Whittier House and run it as an inn for worse. Hector's mouth dropped open. An inn? You mean like a hotel? An exclusive hotel, but yes, that's the plan. Colin's not going to sell it? Not unless the inn turns out to be a bad idea for some reason. I'll be damned. Hector dangled his work-roughened hands between his knees and stared at them. Well, I knew something had to change around here, but I never figured on this. He shrugged and glanced up at her. Guess it doesn't matter. Either way, I'm outta here. She'd expected that reaction, but she wasn't going to quietly accept his resignation. I wish you'd consider staying on, Hector. It's your home and we need you here. I need you here. Nah, you don't. Get a younger man in. In fact, get a younger crew. You'll need a more organized deal than an old guy and his ragtag bunch of teenage whores that come over every summer from Seattle. Speaking of that, why haven't any shown up yet? It's June. They're out of school by now. After Geraldine died, I put out the call that we wouldn't need them this year. But it's a tradition, Hector. You've been doing that for years now. More than 40, he said with a touch of pride. Taught those kids the meaning of putting in a good day's work. Taught them about respecting the earth and the creatures that live on it. He sighed. But that wouldn't work. For a fancy hotel. Oh yes it would. It's a community service. Luna had come up with yet another marketing hook. I'll bet the kids you hired grew up and sent their kids over. Many did. Last summer I even had a couple of grandkids from my first batch. 3 generations coming over here to earn a little, spending money doing something healthy, something that works those young muscles. Hector. She almost reached for his hands, but decided he wouldn't welcome that kind of familiarity. You're an institution around here. A celebrity. A red flush rose from beneath his collar. I wouldn't go that far. I would. Guests will come just to reminisce about the summers they spent working here. They'll want to see how the trees grown that they planted, or whether the flower beds still curve the way they remembered, or whether y'all still have trouble with weeds in the croquet lawn. We have history here. Living history. Don't leave. I don't want to lose all that. He looked dazed. I never thought of it that way. I might not have either, except that I visited my grandparents today. You did? How did that go? It was interesting, but the minute I mentioned Whittier House they started talking about how much Byron loved coming here to work. They wanted to know if you still worked here, and they want to visit and talk about him a little bit. It would help them, I think. Hector nodded, which Luna took as a good sign. Then he glanced at her. You haven't had much tradition in your life, have you? No, I haven't. None really. That's probably why I recognize how important it is, and why I want to preserve it whenever I can. Please stay, Hector. I promise to think about it. Good. She was in a lot better position with Hector than she'd been before. She'd keep her fingers crossed that he'd make the decision that would, she believed, make everyone happy. She wanted to say something about Althea, but hesitated, not sure how he'd take it. But if she didn't say something now, she might never get another chance. Edwina, my grandmother, said she knew Althea, your mate. His head came up quickly, and his tone was almost harsh. What did she say? Only that it was very sad. Hector blew out a breath and looked toward a point where sky and sea blended together, obscuring the horizon. It was sad and unnecessary. A simple fall in our kitchen. Her head hit the counter just right. Massive concussion. Luna gasped. She was gone. He snapped his fingers. Just like that. It happened nearly 50 years ago, and I still remember it like it was yesterday. Nobody talks about it anymore, though, especially me. He looked at her. That's probably a mistake not to talk about it. I think it might be. Especially if you loved her very much. She was my true mate. I could never love anyone the way I loved Althea. Here. I'll show you something. Standing, he dug in the pocket of his work pants and pulled out a small shiny object. She wore this around her neck all the time. Only took it off when she shifted into her form, but otherwise always wore it. Luna gazed at the tiny gold trinket made up of 2 entwined hearts with a small diamond in the middle. She doubted it was worth much money, but to Hector it was priceless. It's beautiful. It's always with me. That way Althea's always with me. He tucked it carefully back in his pocket and sat down again. Luna's throat tightened. She wanted to be loved like that. Even more. Specifically, she wanted to be loved like that by Colin MacDowell, Laird of Glenbarra, the Wer who had stolen her heart. But it was a foolish wish that had almost no chance of coming true. Chapter 24. Colin hoped the discussion between Luna and Hector was going well. They were still talking when the installation crew left, and before Colin could walk over to the bench, the household staff trooped out to view the new addition. Colin suspected somebody had been sneaking out periodically to report on the progress. Dulcie came over doing a little cha-cha step on the croquet lawn. Party time. Oh yeah, time to partay. Is it filled yet? Sybil followed close behind Dulcie, her eyes bright but her enthusiasm held carefully in check. I know these things take a lot of time to fill. It's filled, Colin said. The chemicals are in and the hot tub is officially open for business. They promised us a functioning hot tub by the cocktail hour, and through the wonders of prefabricated construction they've accomplished it. He glanced at Dulcie and Sybil and smiled. How come you aren't in your suits already? Because, Dulcie said, we happen to have manners and we're waiting to be invited. Then consider yourselves invited. Woohoo! Dulcie pumped both fists in the air. Come on, Sybil, let's get. Janet. Oh wait. Are we allowed to bring appetizers and a bottle of wine? We shouldn't do that, Sybil said. Hot water and alcohol don't mix. They do in my world, Dulcie said. What's the verdict, your lairdness? The water's not very hot yet. I'll turn the thermostat down if you want wine. So which will it be? Hot water or wine? Dulcie stuck her hand in the air. I vote for wine. Sybil. Wine, I guess. Still warm out. We don't need the water too hot. Let's get Janet. Is this a private party? Colin asked. Or can anybody join in? Sybil blinked. You want to go hot tubbing with us? Why not? Let's christen the thing. I have a couple of chores to take care of. But then I'll put on my suit and be down. You have a suit? I always pack one when I come to Whittier House. I usually go down to Happy Hour Beach for a swim, but I think we need to try out this hot tub. I'll ask Hector and Luna on my way back to the house. Hector won't go for it, Dulcie said. He doesn't do anything fun. But ask Luna. She'll want to. We'll be back in a flash. I'll get there as soon as I can. Colin couldn't picture this kind of informal celebration ever taking place at MacDowell House in Glenbarra. The atmosphere there was serious, deadly serious. As he walked over to the temperature control and turned it down several notches, he thought about whether Luna would like MacDowell House at all. It was a Scottish castle, an authentic one as opposed to the new modernized version Henry had built for Geraldine. MacDowell House was the real deal, and it had the bulky plumbing and moldy storerooms to prove it. He loved the place, but he wasn't sure if Luna, used to Whittier House's conveniences, would. And then there was the issue of the general mood of the place. His mother and father weren't party animals, that was for sure. Duncan could be counted on to cheer things up, though. If Colin showed up with Luna, and Duncan invited a lively female friend, the four of them might be able to blow the cobwebs out of the dreary old place. That was pure fantasy, of course. Luna wouldn't want to go in the first place. He needed to stop thinking about impossible dreams and enjoy her company while he could, along with that of her 3 partners in crime. Who knew? Maybe she'd worked miracles with Hector and he'd decide to hop in too. Colin approached the spot where Hector and Luna sat talking. Hot tubs. Ready, he said. Or I should say warm tubs ready. Dulcie and Sybil want to drink wine, so I turned the temperature down. We're all invited to join them. I'm going upstairs to change into my suit. Hector stood. Count me out. Not my thing. He paused and studied Colin for a moment. Luna seems to think I should stay on even though you're turning this into a fancy hotel. I say I'd be out of place. Luna knows what she's doing, Colin said. A smart word would stick around. Which didn't make Colin very smart now, did it? I told her I'd give it some thought. Well, time for me to be off. I'll leave. You all to your community bathtub. He headed toward the small groundskeeper's cottage he'd lived in for decades, but his step seemed lighter than it had a day ago. Colin took Hector's place on the stone bench. Sounds as if you presented your case well, lass. I realize that he's been bringing teenagers here to work all these years, which makes him a draw for those who want to come back and reminisce about old times on La Florette. He's up to the 3rd generation in some families. That's loyalty. Colin gazed at her with admiration. Brilliant concept, Luna. And I'll bet it made him feel valued to hear you say that he was an important part of the operation. I think so. He told me something interesting. George Trevelyan worked out here very briefly as a teenager, and according to Hector, George always considered himself in competition with my father. Colin digested that piece of information. That doesn't surprise me at all. Wish? What? He shook his head. It's pointless. I just wish I could be here to see how this shakes out with your grandparents and George. He sighed. But I can't. So I should quit brooding about it and enjoy the time I have left with you. She reached over and squeezed his hand. Go on and take care of your reservations and then come down and join the party. We'll keep you occupied for the first half of the night, and I'll take it from there. He turned his hand over and wove his fingers through hers. That sounds promising. I don't intend to waste a minute of the time you have left. Y'all can sleep on the plane. That's fine for me, but you have to work after I leave. And that's what will keep me sane, she said. I'll be so busy I'll barely notice you're gone. Really? No, not really. But it's the closest thing to a strategy I've got, so I'm going with it. She slipped her hand from his and stood. Time to get moving. Your much honored lairdness. I'll meet you back at the hot tub. Or we could run away together. He hadn't meant to say it, but she looked so beautiful standing in the sunlight, her eyes bright as emeralds. She shook her head and gave him a tiny smile. Don't be daft. Turning, she hurried toward the house. So that was that. He'd asked her and she'd refused. Time to make those plain reservations. Had he meant that? Luna couldn't imagine that Colin had seriously asked her to run away with him, but she couldn't get the question out of her mind as she pulled a one-piece bathing suit out of her drawer. Geraldine had talked her into this suit after meeting resistance on the purchase of a bikini. Luna stepped into the emerald green suit, which had laces up each side. Once, Luna had modeled it for Geraldine. She proclaimed it sexier than a bikini. Thoughts of Geraldine combined with Colin's outrageous suggestion. What would Geraldine have done? That was easy. She would have responded, let's go instead of your daft. Geraldine had, in fact, run away with Henry, or at least stayed with him in America when the MacDowells ordered her home. Geraldine had thrown caution to the winds, laughed at everyone's expectations, and made a life with the were she loved. Had Henry suggested running away together in that same offhand, almost teasing way? Luna sighed. Geraldine, I wish you were here. Grabbing a towel and slipping her feet into flip-flops, she hurried out of the house and over to the hot tub, where the party was already in progress. Hey Luna. Dulcie waved at her from her spot in the bubbling water. This is awesome. You and Colin picked out a great model. That's good. She hurried across the croquet lawn. She smelled fresh lumber and a hint of pool chemicals as she climbed the sturdy steps to the deck area. Killer suit, Dulcie added. Will it to me, okay? Sure thing. Luna laid her towel on the decking. Sybil lay in the water with her head propped on a towel and her eyes closed as she cradled her wine glass in both hands. I'm in heaven, she said. If I'm not, don't bother telling me. They should have hot tubs in heaven. Amen to that. Janet sat on one of the molded benches. Her lick recovered. Breasts bobbed in the water as she munched on a piece of cheese. Oh, and not to worry. Dinner's baking in the oven. There's a salad in the fridge and desserts in the freezer. Luna climbed into the tub next to Janet. I never doubted that you'd have everything under control. Have some wine, chica. Dulcie handed Luna a plastic glass of white. Fortunately, I found these plastic doodads in the pantry. I'm not a big rules person, but we need some for this most excellent hot tub. No glass for one thing. Sybil sipped her wine, her eyes still closed. And no negative comments ever. I'm finding my zen. Janet laughed. Don't mind her. She's going all California on us. But I sort of agree with that. Geraldine would have too. To Geraldine. Dulcie lifted her glass. To Geraldine. They all cried in unison. Luna glanced around at her new friends and knew she couldn't run away with Colin and leave them in the lurch, even if he had been serious, which he probably hadn't. They also deserved to know the news about her that could break at any moment. Hector wasn't the only one who needed to hear it. She took a fortifying gulp of her wine. I need to tell y'all something. You've slept with Colin, Dulcie said. Old news. That wasn't what I was going to tell you. Sybil's eyes popped open. He has a tiny little wiener? I don't want to hear that. I want to keep my illusions. No. Honestly, y'all are so fixated on sex that it's pitiful. This is important. My mother was a human. No way. Dulcie stared at Luna in obvious fascination. Girl, you know how to keep a secret. Hey. Janet made shushing movements at Dulcie. This could be a painful situation for our Luna. Have a little compassion. I don't care if your mother was a gecko, Sybil said. You're still tops in my book. A gecko. Dulcie started to laugh. Sybil is officially toasted. But I second what she said. Your parentage isn't really important, but I've never known anyone who's half were and half human, so I'm just curious. Sorry if I offended. I'm not offended. Luna felt a rush of affection for her three friends. She would watch out for them no matter what. But I was worried that no one would accept me if they knew, so I've kept it to myself. Janet poured herself more wine. If anyone has a problem with it, tell them to come and see me. I have a drawer full of very sharp knives. And a cleaver. I have cleaning products that would fell an ox, Sybil said. One blast from my spray bottle, and they'll wish they'd never been born. And I can do wicked things with a broom handle, Dulcie said. Wait a minute. That sounded rather exciting instead of threatening. Let me rephrase that. Forget about the broom handle, Dulce, Janet said. That's only going to get you into trouble. You know karate, remember? Oh right. I'm a black belt, come to think of it. And hey, if none of this works, we'll just go all war on whoever threatens our Luna, right? Right. Everyone shouted. Luna didn't know whether to laugh or cry. Thanks. You guys are terrific. Was so worried, and you don't even care. We care about you toots, Dulcie said. And I'm so delighted that you're not a virgin anymore. Luna gasped. You knew I was? Oh please. Dulcie rolled her eyes. When it came to sex, you were dumb as a box of rocks. We all took a straw poll and the results came out solidly in favor of virginity as the only logical explanation because you were so smart. In every other way. Luna set her glass on the deck. I'm so embarrassed. She allowed herself to sink down until the water covered her head. Janet grabbed a handful of hair and pulled her back up. Ow! Luna rubbed her scalp. Janet smiled at her. Didn't want you to drown from being embarrassed. Now that we know you grew up in a somewhat wonky fashion, it all makes sense. And now, Dulcie said, we can tell dirty jokes and you'll actually get them instead of just pretending to. Luna retrieved her wineglass and took another gulp. I didn't know I was such a burden on y'all. You haven't been, sweetie, Janet said. You've been a joy, and however you influenced his lairdness to go along with the end project, we're grateful. Hear, hear. Dulcie hoisted her wineglass in the air again. To Luna! To Luna! All three of them shouted as Luna turned pink with a combination of embarrassment and pleasure. Give me a glass, said a male voice. I'll drink to that. Well, Dulcie said, if it isn't the Laird of Glenbarra, the stout lad who deflowered our Luna. Colin grinned at her. Congratulations, Dulcie. You finally got my title. Right. Luna took a deep breath and sank back under the water. Chapter 25. Colin hesitated to intrude on the female bonding he heard going on as he approached the hot tub, but he'd promised Luna he'd show up, and he was a who kept his word. Fortunately, he'd caught enough of the conversation to know that Luna would have a support system after he left. George Trevelyan wouldn't ride roughshod over this lot. This is not a bad hot tub, is it? He climbed in on the other side of Luna and glanced down. She was still under the water. Does she do that often? I don't know, Sybil said. This is our first time to go hot tubbing with her. Dulcie handed him a glass of white wine. For all we know, she's a hot tub virgin. About that time, Luna erupted from the water, gasping for air. Y'all are talking about me. I can feel it. We are, Colin said solemnly. And the big question of the day, the one all our viewers want answered, is, are you a hot tub virgin? Okay, Dulcie said, pointing at Colin. He can hang with us anytime. Am I right? You are so right, Sybil said. He can even bring his pet gecko if he wants. Janet snorted. I don't know what it is with Sybil and the geckos all of a sudden, but it's sort of disturbing. So are you? Dulcie asked Luna. Am I what? A hot tub virgin, Janet said. Try to keep up. Yes. Luna threw her arms in the air, splashing water everywhere. I'm a hot tub virgin, and a phone sex virgin, and a vibrator virgin. She glanced around. Whoops. Did I overshare? Dulcie was laughing so hard she almost choked. No, she said, gasping for breath. Feel free to drink more wine. And tell us anything you want. Luna ducked under the water again and combed her hair back from her face. She looked like a mermaid as she peeked at Colin through lashes dotted with water. We're not always like this. Yes, we are, Sybil said. We're just not always this wet. Colin smiled down at Luna. It's great. I like it. See. Dulcie stood and refilled everyone's wine glass. He likes it. Luna. Babe, I don't know what you've got going with this gorgeous were, but he's a keeper. He's going back to Scotland tomorrow, Luna said. He's not. Dulcie looked horrified. Tell me it isn't so, Laird of Glenbarra. Just when I learned to say your title. It's true. He took another swallow of wine. I need to straighten out a few things with my younger brother Duncan. Dulcie's eyes widened. Be still, my heart. You have a brother? I do. Is he as good looking as you? Colin smiled. Better. Well then that settles it. Dulcie finished topping off everyone's wine. You go right back there and you bring him over here. If he needs straightening out, we're just the crew to handle it, right ladies? Right, rang a chorus of female voices. Colin could swear Luna's was among them. He wondered how Duncan would react to this bunch. Chances were he'd fit right in. It was definitely something to think about. Oh, my God. Sybil sat up and wiped a hand over her face. Do my eyes deceive me, or is that Hector walking this way in a bathing suit? Got it. Looks ancient. I hope it stays on him. Janet turned. It is Hector, she said in a low voice. Don't anybody say anything crazy or you'll scare him away. We're about to make Whittier House history, so don't any of you muck it up. I'm sorry, Dulcie said, but that's just not how I roll. She made a megaphone of her hands. Hey Hector, get your bony ass over here. We've been waiting for you. I thought so, Hector yelled back. How could you have a decent party without the Hector man? The Hector man? Janet looked around frantically. Is hell freezing over? Is the world coming to an end? I can't handle the shock. It's all Luna's doing. Colin leaned down to kiss her wet cheek. That's not true, Luna said. It's just us, all of us working together. Yeah, Janet said, but it's also you toots. We were blessed the day you showed up. I hope you plan to stick around. I do. As Colin heard the ring of certainty in her voice, he knew the answer to the question he posed earlier, the one she'd called daft. No, she wouldn't run away with him. She was anchored to this place and these friends as well she should be after all the years she'd spent as a vagabond. Only a selfish lover would insist that she give up the first safe, secure home she'd ever known. Only someone protecting his own interests would rip her from this spot in hope that she'd flourish in an alien environment. He wanted only the best for her. And from what he could tell, the best was right here on Lou Floret. Luna had never been surrounded by so many wers who cared about her. Laughing with them, teasing and being teased was so new and so special. Best of all, she could share this time with Colin, who seemed to enjoy himself as much as she did. She longed to stop time and hold them all in this moment forever. But Dulcie said she was turning into a prune, and they'd finished the wine, and Hector said he was cold, although he'd been as boisterous and crazy as the rest of them. Luna hoped this was the night he started taking some joy in life. As they left the hot tub, they all agreed to meet in the dining room for dinner after they showered and changed. Eating together wasn't their normal routine, but it was appropriate for this special night, the last night Colin would be in residence. Everyone pitched in to get the food on the table, and more bottles of wine were opened. As a farewell meal for the owner of Whittier House, the much honored Colin MacDowell, Laird of Glenbarra, it worked. Hector even proposed a toast to the success of the Whittier House Inn, and Luna knew then that she'd convinced him to stay on. The inn would be blending of the old and the new, and Luna was optimistic about its future, even with George Trevelyan hovering menacingly in the background. They talked a little business during dinner, and Colin had suggested creating a walk-in freezer out of a little used pantry. Hector thought he'd need a riding mower, and Dulcie said the vacuum cleaner should be upgraded. None of it was startling, and everyone seemed confident they could handle the new regime just fine. They all agreed that with a concerted effort, they could open for business the first weekend in August. Can you be here? Janet asked Colin. Luna was glad Janet had asked the question instead of her. I don't know, Colin said. I can certainly try. If not, you can always make a video, Luna said. He gave her a long-suffering glance as everyone asked about the video, and he had to explain that he wasn't doing a video come hell or high water. He'd do his best to be here in person, he said. Luna wasn't counting on it. He'd meant to come back while Geraldine was alive, too, and the obligations in Scotland had prevented him from returning. Considering that, she wouldn't expect him at all, and be thrilled if he happened to show up every couple of years. Obviously, if she could wave a magic wand to stop Colin from leaving, she'd be tempted to do it, but then he wouldn't handle the family problems that troubled him so. He did have to leave, and she'd face that reality. As they all sat discussing more plans for the grand opening, Luna thought about the good fortune that had led her here. She loved the island and the castle, but she loved these wers far more. They were her family as much, or maybe more than her grandparents. They accepted her for who she was. At last there were no more secrets, which meant the friendship and love would grow as they all worked together to make Whittier House a success. She was home at last. Sybil finished off the last of her dessert and laid down her fork. You know what we should do now. We should all go back to our rooms, shift, and go for a run in the woods. It would be like old times. Sybil. Dulcie gazed at her in open admiration. That's a brilliant idea. I have ideas sometimes, Sybil said. I just don't usually mention them, because I'm afraid they're stupid, but we've had such a great time and it seems fitting on Colin's last night that we should all go for a run. She glanced around the table. I'm faster than I look. I'm not, Janet said, but I wouldn't mind working off a little of that dinner. Let's do it. I would love for us to go for a run, Luna said. Thanks for suggesting it. Sybil. She made a mental note to draw Sybil out more as the weeks went by. She'd been living in Dulcie's shadow far too long. Does the front door still have that revolving panel in the bottom section? Colin asked. Yep. Dulcie nodded. I tested it just the other day. I've been hankering for a run, but I didn't really want to go alone. I would have gone, Sybil said. I didn't know anybody else wanted to. I think this is a great idea, Colin said. But I haven't run through these woods since I was 17. Anybody want to volunteer to take point? Me, Hector said. We'll meet down by my cottage. I go for a run nearly every night, so I know the best trails. All heads turned toward Hector. Luna was beginning to wonder if she'd completely underestimated the groundskeeper. Dulcie was the first to comment as usual. Hector, you sly were. I had no idea you've been gallivanting through the woods every night. Maybe sometime you'd take me along. I might. He gave her an assessing look. If you think you're up to it. I can certainly keep up with you, you old were. Hector smiled. We'll see about that, won't we? Luna was fascinated by the interchange. Hector seemed to have dropped 10 years in the past few hours, and Dulcie had definitely taken note of it. Interesting. Let's carry the dishes to the kitchen and stick them in the dishwasher before we go, Sybil said. Janet shouldn't have to come back to a mess. Good plan, Luna said. Excellent plan, Janet said. Thanks, Sybil. Sybil flushed. You're welcome. Luna smiled to herself. Sybil, having scored with her previous idea, had promptly lobbed in another one. No doubt about it, Sybil had promise. Maybe Luna should ask if Sybil wanted to learn how to keep the books for Whittier House. With everyone helping, the dishes were dispensed with quickly and they each left for their respective rooms. Luna gave silent thanks that Colin had encouraged her to shift the night before in the penthouse. Otherwise she might have begged off for fear she'd keep everyone waiting. Instead she was eager to join in the fun. Even so, she wondered if they'd all be down at the cottage ahead of her. Once she'd shifted, she loped out of her room and started down the stairs. Colin, his chocolate and caramel coat shining in the light from the chandelier, waited for her at the bottom of the stairs. He glanced up when she appeared. There you are. I know I'm slow. Is everyone else already outside? She hated being the last one out the door. She'd have to do this more often, so she got faster. Don't worry. Janet just went through the door. You're not that slow. She joined him at the bottom of the stairs. Thanks to you. Thank you for last night. His blue eyes flashed with amusement. Which part? All parts. Now let's go. She trotted quickly toward the door and pushed her head against the bottom section. It revolved silently, giving her ample room to step through. She turned as Colin came out the door right behind her. He barely fit, but she didn't expect her future guests to be bigger than he was, so the door should be adequate. He gave the panel a nudge, and it clicked back into place. She stayed by his side as they loped toward Hector's cottage. Maybe when the inn opens I should offer nightly guided runs. Colin glanced at her without breaking stride. Led by Hector? He'll do it. He's an interesting were. Colin snorted softly. Dulcie seems to think so too. I'll let you know what happens. She planned to keep in touch with Colin by phone and email, which might be more frustrating than no contact at all, but she'd take what she could get. I'm glad we're doing this group run. Colin's voice was clear and strong. But when it's over, don't go in. I want time alone with you. She was amused by the alpha nature of that statement. He didn't ask. He announced. At times he could be open and flexible, but this wasn't one of them. He was in full wolf mode. Because she wanted alone time as much as he did, she would agree, but she couldn't resist teasing him. I'm at your command, you're much honored. Lairdness. He looked over at her. Good. She couldn't be sure, but she thought he was smiling. They reached Hector's stone cottage and found his small front yard dominated by the presence of 3 wolves. Dulcie was the trimmest of the females and her reddish coat had a slight curl to it. Sybil remained stocky in her form and had a glossy black coat similar to Luna's. Janet was broad of chest and her rich brown coat looked well cared for. Hector hadn't shown up yet, and then Luna saw him coming around from the back of the cottage. She stared at the large silver wolf as he walked with regal assurance to the front of the cottage. As a human, Hector wasn't the sort anyone would notice, but as a wolf he was imposing. Luna glanced over at Dulcie to see how she'd reacted to Hector's somewhat grand entrance. Dulcie seemed riveted by the sight of Hector, his head held high as he surveyed the small pack he was about to lead through the forest. Hector looked at each wolf in turn, as if counting noses. We're all here. Even his voice sounded stronger. Follow me. Dulcie leaped into action and took off after Hector. Janet and Sybil followed. Colin held back. Go ahead of me, Luna. Hector's taken point, so I'll guard the rear. Luna had never run with a pack of wolves before, but Colin had, so she followed instructions and bolted into the trees after Sybil. Joy rocketed through her as her fantasy came to life, running full out along a narrow path. Through the trees she stretched her muscles and savored the freedom of using her powerful legs the way they were meant to be used. Leaves scattered beneath her paws as she ran. Along the way she caught the scent and sounds of night creatures, the soft hoot of an owl, the scurrying feet of raccoons, the sour smell of a skunk that had crossed the path. Best of all, she wasn't alone. Colin's voice came from behind her. Having a good time? Colin, I love this. All these years I've missed so much. And now you can have it all. That startled her. Did he really think he meant so little to her? Not quite. All Colin. Tonight then. Tonight you can have it all. Yes, and it would have to be enough. Chapter 26. Colin hadn't been sure that he'd recognize the route after 15 years, but he did. A few trees had fallen and others had grown, but Hector obviously maintained this running path along with everything else on the estate, and he'd used it even when no one else had. The route took them in a large circle that would end at Hector's cottage. Once around should be plenty for Janet and Sybil, but Colin fully expected Hector and Dulcie to add a second lap. Luna, who wasn't used to this, already sounded out of breath. Yet she kept bravely on as Hector broke out of the trees and skirted a bluff. On the far side of the island, few boats came this way in daylight, and none at night. That was fortunate because if anyone happened to spot wolves running along a bluff in the San Juan Islands, wildlife officials would seek access to the area. But Wers had learned to be very careful. They'd successfully kept their presence a secret for centuries, which was why this new concept of mating with humans was so risky. Luna's mother had apparently kept the secret, but what if she hadn't? Colin couldn't agree with Byron Reynaud's decision to mate with a human, just as he couldn't agree with Duncan's stated desire to do it. Although Colin might not be able to keep Duncan from making a potentially dangerous mistake, he had to try. But bloody hell, how he hated the idea of leaving Luna tomorrow morning. She would be fine though, after seeing how the staff had rallied around her this afternoon. He was not worried about whether she could survive without him. It wasn't Luna's mental health that concerned him now. It was his own. 3/4 of the way around the circle, Janet slowed to a trot. Sybil's telepathic message floated through the cool night air. Thank you, Janet. I was dying back here. Then Luna, her sides heaving, also slowed to a trot. I like this running business, but I need to get in shape. Janet's trot became a walk. We all do. Well, 3 of us. Dulcie's doing just fine. The show-off. Sybil snorted. Showing off for Hector. And he's showing off for her. Janet tossed her head. I didn't see that coming. Luna added to the telepathic conversation. I think it's sweet. They could be good for each other. She glanced back at Colin, who had slowed to a walk, along with the female Wers. Sorry, Colin. Y'all would probably rather be running. I'm fine. I don't mind conserving my energy. He wondered if she'd figure out what he was conserving it for. She must have, because she looked back at him with a definite gleam in her eyes. When they reached the end of the path, Hector and Dulcie stood waiting for them. They barely looked winded. Dulcie faced the latecomers. Who's up for another lap? Hector and I are going around again. Janet shook her head. Not me. Sybil flopped to the ground. I'm done. Colin decided this was the moment to break off from the group. Luna and I are going down to Happy Hour Beach. We'll see you all in the morning. He turned and started back to the main house. Luna fell into step beside him immediately, but she glanced over her shoulder as she walked away. Bye y'all. He was going to miss that sweet southern accent, although he could hear it over the phone whenever he called, but a phone call wouldn't give him what he had in mind right now. He walked faster. Impatient, your lairdness? He slowed down. Yes, but you're tired. Sorry. Not that tired. She trotted ahead of him. Got your second wind? Could be. Race you to the bluff. He could have outrun her, but he didn't try. Instead, he loped alongside her and matched her stride. When she picked up speed, so did he. When she slowed, he slowed. You have good rhythm. Can you dance? Yes. He thought of the lessons he'd been forced to take as a youngster. Can you? No, you'd have to teach me like you've had to teach me most everything. I'll teach you next time I visit. All right. He was glad she hadn't asked him when that would be, because he couldn't give her an answer. They reached the stone steps leading down to the beach, and he went first, testing to make sure it wasn't too slippery for them. The steps were damp, but if he moved slowly, he kept his balance. He turned back to her. Watch your step. I'm a very careful were. That's how I've survived this long on my own. You're not on your own anymore. I know. I have Janet, Sybil, Dulcie, and Hector. And maybe my grandparents. He accepted the fact that she hadn't included him, although mentally he put himself squarely on her list. If she needed him, he would come. It might take him at least 12 hours, but he would get on the first available plane. He doubted she'd require that kind of heroic gesture, though. He reached the bottom of the steps and gazed up as she came toward him. The scent of her was an aphrodisiac that never failed to arouse him. He'd wanted her from the moment they'd met, and his response to her had only grown stronger. A leisurely stroll along the beach sounded like a nice prelude to her sex. When she reached the sand, he turned to lead the way to the far corner of the Crescent Beach. She obviously had a different scenario in mind. With a yelp of pure pleasure, she took off, flinging sand in his face. He spit it out and raced after her. He'd been thinking sweet and romantic. He didn't know what the bloody hell she was thinking. The night had been calm until now, but now the weather was changing. Clouds scud across the sky, driven by a wind that whipped the waves and sent them pounding against the shore. The water was wild, and so was Luna. She splashed through the swirling water and danced with the surf. Pausing, she lifted her head and looked over her shoulder. Come on, play with me. And then he understood. This was her way of handling their inevitable parting. She'd work off the tension she felt by cavorting in the sea. They would come together eventually. He was confident of that. But first they would chase away their demons by playing in the waves. He plunged toward her, but spun away at the last moment to lead her in a race across the wet sand. She followed, and in a startling burst of speed, she passed him and jumped straight into the waves. Well, if she was going to swim, so would he. The cold water shocked his system, but once he started swimming, he began to warm up. Moving fast, he put himself between Luna and open water. She swam to the end of the crescent before turning toward shore. Thrashing through the waves, she regained solid footing, and Colin followed close behind. He arrived just in time for her thorough body shake. The shower of salt water didn't matter. He was already soaked. But he took some satisfaction in shaking next to her so that his spray covered her, as well. She dropped into a play bow, and then raced away again. He took off after her, all the while thinking he hadn't had to work this hard to pin a female in his entire sexual history. Maybe that was the idea. She'd been a willing partner from the first time he'd kissed her, mostly because she'd been dying of curiosity. But now she understood the process and might think he needed a challenge. He could imagine her deciding that his last episode with her shouldn't be too easy for him. He'd been willing to play along, but by God, she'd had the upper hand long enough. He caught up with her halfway down the beach and dashed in front of her, blocking her path. She whirled and started back the other way, but he got there first. She wouldn't win this game. He'd spent far more time as a wolf, and when he Put his mind to it, he could outmaneuver anywhere. The chase had accomplished one thing, however. He wanted her with a fierceness that put every other coupling to shame. She stood panting at the edge of the water, the surf sliding up over her paws. Holding her gaze, he advanced. Game over, Luna. Maybe, maybe not. Wheeling, she ran back into the water. He reached her before she lost her footing and mounted her before she could dodge away. Be still. Miraculously, she was. He managed to keep his balance as the waves rolled past, surging against his groin as he sank into her. The pleasure surpassed anything he'd known, and he concentrated on that pleasure as he blocked any thought of a soul-deep connection. The possibility hovered on the edges of his consciousness, but he denied it with every frenzied movement of his hips. When he felt her contract around him, he surrendered to a mind-shattering climax. Then it was over. The water cradled them both as he stayed buried within her and stared out at the rolling sea. They'd shared so much, including this numbing sorrow for what could not be. There were moments, Luna realized, when silence was kinder than words. She and Colin returned to Whittier House. Neither spoke. Yet she knew he battled the same bittersweet emotion that filled her heart. The incredible joy of their physical connection was overshadowed by the knowledge that their special time together was nearly over. She tried to lighten the intensity with her beach romp, and he'd obviously understood. Her plan had even worked for a while, but then passion had taken over, sending them dangerously close to a true mating. They'd fought that urge and won. Sadly, they'd won. As if they both understood the cost of that victory, they'd touched noses in the entry hall and parted. She would see him again before he left, but this was the private farewell they would both remember. She should take comfort in knowing he was as miserable as she was, but that didn't work for her. For the first time she began to understand why Hector had shut himself away from the world. Luna didn't plan to do that, but she understood the motivation. Turning herself into a recluse wouldn't benefit anyone, especially Colin. As the manager of the Whittier House Inn, she would stay visible and actively promote the business in any way she could. Colin left the following morning in a flurry of goodbyes. Luna's comments mingled with everyone else's as they all gathered in the entry hall in a tableau similar to the one when he'd arrived. But so much had changed between his arrival and departure. Luna didn't watch the helicopter take off. She had her limits. When the sound of the rotor shook the house, she was in her office with the door closed, working on spreadsheets. If she took a few seconds to bury her face in her hands and weep a little, no one had to know. She kept herself extremely busy for the rest of the day. Colin sent her a short text message when he landed in Glasgow, but there was nothing personal in it. Luna forced herself to delete it from her phone. After a fitful night's sleep, she was at her desk again early the next morning, comparing linen prices online. The phone on her desk rang and she debated how to answer. Should she say Whittier House or Whittier House Inn and get the ball rolling? She settled on giving that ball a swift kick toward the goal. Whittier House Inn. This is Luna Reynaud. How may I help you? Miss Reynaud. The voice was crisp and female. I have George Trevelyan on the line. Please hold. Luna was taken aback. She'd never dealt with someone who employed an assistant to place phone calls, but she probably should get used to it. If Whittier House became as popular as she hoped, the rich and famous would flock to the island. Good morning, Luna. George's voice contained equal notes of friendly condescension and somber concern. How are you? I'm fine, George. She did her best to match his tone. How are y'all? As a matter of fact, I'm troubled. I'm sorry to hear that. She didn't rise to the bait and ask why. It's imperative that I meet with you ASAP. I have an unexpected opening in my schedule tomorrow. Knox can pick you up around 10 and bring you to my office. Her jaw tightened at his assumption that she'd drop everything to meet with him, but she reminded herself that was an alpha tactic. Unfortunately, I can't get away tomorrow. That is unfortunate. He sighed. Then I'll come to you. I can be there by 3. She worked to keep her breathing steady. She would not allow him to steamroll her. I'm afraid that's not convenient either. He adopted a more coaxing tone. Surely you could spend 30 minutes with me, Luna. I promise not to stay long. I just want to discuss something with you concerning your project. It's an excellent idea and I want it to succeed. She wondered what was so urgent that he'd fly over for a 30-minute meeting. If he was determined to meet with her, maybe she should just get it over with. All right, she said. I'll see you at 3 tomorrow. Good. See you then. He disconnected the call. Luna replaced the phone in its holder. She couldn't help feeling uneasy about George inviting himself over, but he'd said he wanted the inn to succeed, so perhaps she had nothing to worry about. Besides, he couldn't negotiate a buy-in by talking with her. Colin owned Whittier House, so if George planned to bully his way into being a partner, he'd have to deal with Colin. She could claim one small victory in the conversation, though. George had summoned her to his office, and she'd refused to be summoned. If she had to meet with him, at least she'd be doing it on her turf, backed up by her staff. And that staff needed to be informed of George's impending visit. After she reached everyone by cell phone, they gathered in the kitchen. He took a stool around the center island. Even Hector showed up, scraping the mud off his work boots. He chose a stool next to Dulcie. Luna described the phone call and the outcome. Then she cleared her throat. I just want to warn everyone that George Trevelyan has his eye on this place. He'd like to make it part of his empire, and both Colin and I are against it. I'm glad to hear that, Hector said. If George gets his hands on Whittier House, I really will quit. Dulcie glanced at him. Then we just won't let that happen, will we? Damn straight, Sybil added. No way can we let some big wheeler dealer muscle his way in. This is our project. Absolutely. Janet slapped a hand on the counter. He may control half of Seattle, but he sure as hell doesn't control what happens on this island. No, he doesn't. Luna loved the way the staff had assumed ownership of the project. They were a force to be reckoned with. But he is powerful and he's used to getting his way. Are you saying we have to treat him with kid gloves? Sybil asked. Hector frowned. I don't much like that idea. You have to stand up to bullies. Like George Trevelyan. I agree, Luna said. To be honest, I'm not sure why he's coming since I have no power to grant him a financial stake in Whittier House. Maybe he hopes to convince me I can't run the inn without his help. I can see him trying to undermine your confidence, Hector said. That was the tactic he used as a teenager. I'll make sure I'm available at 3 tomorrow to monitor the situation. I dare him to find fault with Whittier House, Dulcie said. It rocks. And so do we. Sybil leaned forward. We're all invested in this place, which is why the house is immaculate, the grounds are gorgeous, and the food is to die for. Speaking of food, Janet said, I may show off a little and have my world famous chocolate chip cookies coming out of the oven around 3 tomorrow. Luna smiled with relief. Their moral support meant the world to her. I don't know what I'd do without y'all. We're just grateful you came up with the idea of running Whittier House as an inn, Dulcie said. I wasn't looking forward to taking potluck with the new owner. Sybil nodded. Me either. And we're not going to let George Trevelyan screw things up either. Just tell us if there's anything else we can do to help. Tomorrow. It's enough to know that you're standing by, ready to keep him from marching in here thinking he can boss us around. Sybil lifted her chin. I'd like to see him try. Luna smiled. If mild-mannered Sybil was ready to fight for Whittier House, then George Trevelyan had better watch out. After everyone left to begin their respective tasks, Luna returned to her office. She thought about sending Colin a text message about the visit and decided against it. He'd be busy dealing with the crisis of his brother Duncan's decision to mate with a human. She couldn't go running to him every time something came up, and besides, she didn't know what George had on his mind. She glanced at the clock and automatically added 8 hours, which she'd been doing ever since Colin had left. It would be past 5 in the evening in Scotland. Colin would be looking forward to dinner, perhaps with his family. No, she wouldn't disturb him about this. She and the staff could handle it. Chapter 27. So now you've met Molly. Duncan sat across from Colin at their favorite neighborhood pub in the late afternoon as the afterwork crowd began to drift in. Duncan's dark hair was a typical tousled mess because they'd driven back to the small town of Glenbara with the top down on his MG, but his gray eyes were more thoughtful than usual. What did you think of her? I liked her. As Colin sipped his whiskey, he pictured the petite brunette who'd met them for lunch a few hours ago at a trendy spot in the heart of Glasgow. I wanted to find something wrong with her, but I couldn't. She's all you said she was. Yeah, Molly is terrific. Duncan picked up his glass as if to take a drink, and then put it down again. But as we were sitting there having a nice lunch, I started to ask myself if mating with her is what I really want. Colin stared at him. Pardon. I know. It's a total reversal for me, and usually I dig my heels in when I get an idea. Really? I hadn't noticed. Duncan rolled his eyes. As if you didn't inherit the MacDowell stubborn streak too. I suppose I did. And he'd begun to question what that stubbornness was costing him. But what's changed your mind about Molly? Something you said on the phone keeps running through my mind. Remember that bit about finding someone you can't imagine living without? I do. Colin took a swallow of his whiskey. He hoped the liquor would blunt his longing for a certain lass he was having great difficulty living without. Well, Duncan hesitated. This is hard for me to admit, but as you said, this could be the most important decision I ever make. I love the idea of mating with Molly. I love it a lot. And I love her. But maybe not enough to take this big step. Colin said nothing. He'd spouted off on the phone, but what did he know about such matters? He was a fine one to advise his brother when he couldn't figure out how he wanted to live his own life. The thing is, Duncan continued, I can imagine living without her. And I'm damn sure she can imagine living without me. She's heading off without me next week, as a matter of fact. Are you upset that she's going on holiday without you? Duncan shook his head. Not at all, which proves my point. We have a good time when we're together, but there's no compulsion to be with each other. Do you know what I mean? Colin sighed. But a compulsion to be with someone isn't much of a test either. We can be compelled to be with the wrong person. He took another gulp of his whiskey. Duncan studied him for several seconds. All right, big brother, who is she? Who is who? This wrong person you're compelled to spend time with. Colin scowled at his brother. I didn't say. Don't even try denying it. This is me you're talking to. You've been edgy and distracted ever since I picked you up at the airport, and I blamed it on jet lag and the whole Molly problem. But it's not about me, is it? Who did you meet in America? A sexy human. Colin gazed into his nearly empty glass. Then he polished it off and signaled for another. By the time he'd finished his second whiskey, he'd told Duncan everything except the extremely personal bits. He'd even included the tragic story of Sophie and Byron. Bloody hell. Duncan stared at Colin. What are you going to do? I haven't the faintest idea. Stick it out here and hope the feeling goes away, I guess. Doesn't sound like much fun to me. So far it hasn't been, but I just got back and I mean to give myself time to accept the situation as it is. Duncan shook his head, as if he didn't believe a word of that. You really are a stubborn fool. I'm inclined to agree with you. Draining his glass, Duncan set it on the table. There's one part of the story I don't understand, though. Sophie and Byron must have been truly mated if Sophie got pregnant. That compulsion you keep talking about had to be at work there, right? I assume so. So you're telling me that Sophie, who was compelled to be with Byron and pregnant with his child, ran away? Why would she do that? Colin shrugged. She told Luna she didn't belong there. When Luna realized her father had been she interpreted that to mean her mother hadn't wanted to live with Wers for the rest of her life, so she left. I don't buy it. If she was pregnant, that meant she and Byron had a true mating. There's nothing accidental or casual about that. They went through the mating ritual, and she knew if she got pregnant, her kid might be born where Byron obviously wanted her to stay, and she continued to love him until the day she died. That's not the mark of a quitter. So what happened then? It's hard to say exactly. Duncan rolled his empty glass between his palms. Apparently the rest of the pack didn't know Byron had revealed himself to Sophie, or they'd have tracked her to New Orleans and brought her back to Seattle for security purposes. Right. I thought of that. But let's say one pack member somehow discovered that Sophie was in the know. If that were objected to a human joining the pack, they might have quietly convinced her that Byron's life would be miserable with a human female as his mate. Colin allowed the idea to settle. That's possible. Sad to say, it was the sort of interference he once would have understood, although he liked to think he would have met the problem head-on instead of taking a manipulative approach. He still wasn't convinced that Wers and humans should mate, but a deep and abiding love, nothing and no one should be allowed to sabotage that. So you think she left for his sake? That's more logical than thinking she abandoned her mate because she couldn't deal with the lifestyle. She doesn't come across as that shallow. But if someone told her that the Wers she loved so desperately would be an outcast if she stayed, she very well might leave, especially if she hadn't yet discovered she was pregnant. Reaching for his drink, Colin settled back in his chair. That makes her decision noble instead of cowardly. Luna deserves to hear that theory and maybe check it out. Duncan nodded. But if I were in her shoes, once I suspected that, I'd want to move heaven and earth to uncover the bloody were who ruined so many lives. I think she would, but it could be her grandmother. I don't want to suspect her, but she might have thought she was doing the right thing for her son. Duncan gazed at him across the battered table. In that case, you may decide to leave well enough alone. That's not fair to Luna, who thinks her mother abandoned her father after making a commitment for life. If she investigates and discovers differently, she shouldn't have to deal with the fallout by herself. I sense a trip in your future. Colin's smile was rueful. I hate to wreck your love life and run off, but I'm flying back to Whittier House. I want to tell her about this in person so I can help if she needs me. He dug in his pocket for cash to pay the bill. I've got it. Duncan tossed money on the table. Colin looked up in surprise. Thanks, Dunk. I appreciate it. He couldn't remember the last time Duncan had picked up the tab. Maybe his brother was ready to accept more responsibility, which could mean lightening Colin's load at Glenbara. You're welcome. And while you're at it, you might as well thank me for giving you an excuse to go back to Washington. Colin's denial evaporated when he realized that his brother was right. Viewed dispassionately, Duncan's theory might not warrant a trip across the ocean. Could be explained during a phone call. Luna was a strong female with a good support system. She might not need him as she investigated the possibility that her mother had been coerced into leaving. But he couldn't view anything concerning Luna dispassionately. He might as well admit that he needed her, and that was why he was taking the next available flight to Seattle. He could hardly wait to surprise her with an unexpected visit. You're compelled, old chap, Duncan said. If I were you, I'd pay attention to that. I will. Colin met his brother's gaze and realized that within the past hour, they traded roles. It was a humbling thought, one of many he'd had recently. I definitely will. Luna had hoped Knox would come in with George, but she heard the helicopter take off again before Hector ushered George into the entryway. Once again, George looked like an Eddie Bauer commercial in an open-necked denim shirt and khaki slacks. He stepped forward, his expression almost fatherly. Luna, so good to see you again. Luna drew strength from having Hector standing in the doorway. George, she extended her hand to him but didn't echo his sentiments. I'm sorry Knox couldn't join us. George gave her hand a squeeze and released it. I sent him to Friday Harbor on business. I'll call him when we've wrapped up here. He sniffed the air. Something smells good. Our chef just baked cookies and the coffee's made if you both like to follow me. She started toward the hallway that led to Geraldine's sitting room. Both. George sounded surprised. Luna turned. I thought you'd enjoy reminiscing with Hector about old times, so I invited him to join us. George glanced at the groundskeeper. What old times? When you worked for me. Hector's tone was deceptively casual. Good God, are we talking about the summer after my senior year in high school? I'm sorry, Hector, but I wouldn't be a good companion for a walk down memory lane. I vaguely remember spending a couple of weeks on this island, but I don't remember you at all. Hector seemed unfazed. In that case, I'll just tag along for the sake of the cookies. I can't blame you there, but it would be better if you enjoyed them in the kitchen with the rest of the staff. What I have to discuss with Luna is private. Anger fizzed through Luna's veins as she faced George. I realize that y'all are used to being the one in charge, but with all due respect, I'm in charge. At Whittier House. She glanced at Hector. You're welcome to have coffee with us. The truth is, I have some information about your mother, George said. My mother? Her resistance faltered. That's right. It's of an intimate nature. He shrugged. I'm only considering your feelings. Luna had suspected George knew more about her parents than he'd let on. She was hungry for any insight into the past, but if George was about to reveal something embarrassing or humiliating, she'd need time to process it before sharing it with her friends. After being a lone wolf for so many years, she instinctively protected her secrets. She exchanged a look with Hector, who excused himself but told her he wouldn't be far away if she needed him. Moments after they were settled in easy chairs in Geraldine's sitting room, Janet appeared bearing a silver tray with the coffee, cups, and a basket of fragrant cookies. Janet left the tray and gave Luna's shoulder a squeeze. Before she exited the room, Luna imagined everyone gathered in the kitchen debating what George had to say. That required a private discussion. She was pretty damn curious about that herself. After serving the coffee, she set the basket of cookies within reach of George's chair. She'd always loved those cookies, but this afternoon they might as well be hockey pucks because she'd lost her appetite. Great atmosphere. George drank some coffee and picked up a cookie. I can see why MacDowell went for your plan. Luna set her untouched coffee back on the antique table beside her chair. She'd chosen Geraldine's favorite chair in hopes it would give her strength. What did you want to tell me about my mother? First of all, you look so much like her that it's startling. He bit into the cookie. So you knew exactly who I was from the time I walked into your office, didn't you? He nodded as he chewed his bite of cookie. Then he swallowed. But you didn't seem to want to acknowledge it, so I didn't push. Maybe if you changed your last name and disguised your looks, you might have gotten away with this. She forced herself to take a deep breath before answering. I'm not trying to get away with anything. Aren't you? He skewered her with a glance but then looked away again. So, I could be wrong. Just because your mother was a gold digger doesn't mean you are, I suppose. Her blood ran cold. She was not a gold digger. I didn't say she was an effective gold digger. When she realized that Byron could be disinherited because he was involved with her, she decided to cut and run, so she lost out on the gold after all. That doesn't change her original intent, however. Luna's nails bit into her palms. My mother was not after the Reynaud money. Don't know why you're making up lies about her, but I was there, Luna. I was Byron's cousin and closest friend. I can testify. That's the way it was. He chose another cookie. And here you come along. Attach yourself to a wealthy old woman who conveniently dies, and now you're getting cozy with her heir. Like mother, like daughter. Anger flowed through her like lava. How dare you? I'm not after anyone's money. Maybe not. But now that you've identified yourself as Sophie's daughter, that's the story that will circulate. Once it's out there, the Werewolf community won't come within miles of this place. If you truly want to help Colin, you'll go back where you came from. You're nothing but an anchor around his neck. Her chest was so tight she could barely breathe. I know very well how that story will circulate. You're trying to get rid of me. Bright girl. Why? She gripped the arms of the chair. I'm not the one standing in the way of acquiring an interest in this place. Colin has all the control. Yes, but you're the driving force behind the project, and I've seen the way he looks at you. Once you're gone, he'll lose interest and decide to sell. No, he won't. He loves Whittier House. But the sick feeling in the pit of her stomach told her that George was right. Colin had gone along with the inn project mostly because of her. A few years down the road, if the inn became a huge success, keeping it might be a logical business decision, but right now, he was motivated primarily by his emotional ties, of which she was one. Without her, he might choose to sell, but she couldn't let that happen. Her determination had very little to do with herself anymore. Now she would fight. For the sake of Janet, Dulcie, Sybil, Hector, and even Geraldine, who would have hated the thought of this filthy, rotten were getting his paws on her beloved house. And she would fight for Colin too, who needed a connection with Whittier House, whether he fully realized that or not. The vibration of helicopter blades overhead made them both glance up. George sighed. Kids these days can't follow a simple set of instructions. Well, seeing as how Knox is here already, we might as well cut this chat short. I've said what I came to say. I'm sure you'll do the right thing. She stood, her back straight, her gaze locked with his. You've put me in a tight spot, but I've been in tight spots before. You can't force me to leave. I'll do everything in my power to make sure you never own Whittier House. Stay if you must, but you'll create huge problems for Colin if you do. He stood and reached in his shirt pocket. I'm betting you don't really want to make his life tougher than it already is. He held out an airline ticket. Envelope. I've added a little cash for the journey. Trembling with rage, she smacked the envelope from his hand. It sailed to the floor, spilling $100 bills. He shrugged. I agree that cold, hard cash is a bit insulting, but I'm only trying to smooth your transition. I'll just leave all that there, in case you change your mind. I would rather die than accept anything from y'all. His eyebrows rose. Seriously? You're that stupid? You have no other options. Luna, if you don't leave of your own free will, I'll crush you like a bug and your precious laird with you. Guess again, Trevelyan. Luna's heart slammed into her ribs and she spun toward the doorway, certain she was hallucinating. Colin couldn't be here. He was in Scotland, thousands of miles away. And yet, there he stood, his furious blue gaze fastened on George Trevelyan. For the first time since she'd met the Seattle Pack Alpha, she felt a little sorry for him. But not much. Chapter 28. Luna hadn't called him. Colin took that information like a sucker punch to the gut. She'd planned to handle George Trevelyan on her own, without his help and support. And for that, he had only himself to blame. Why should she call him? He'd constantly reinforced the idea that his precious obligations took precedence over her needs. He'd warned her that his life was in Scotland, not here with her. But the moment he'd walked into the sitting room and discovered Trevelyan there, his priorities had shifted and they were never shifting back. Luna was the center of his existence. If that interfered with his obligations, so be it. George quickly covered his surprise with a genial smile. I swear the world gets smaller every day, MacDowell. Apparently a trip across the pond is nothing more than a long commute for you. Colin walked into the room. Something like that. There was so much he wanted to say to Luna, but he had to keep his attention on George. He flexed his hands, fighting the urge to take George apart physically, but breaking him mentally would be much more effective and wouldn't break up the furniture. If you told me you were coming, I'd have sent Knox over to SeaTac. No worries. I managed. Colin had deliberately chosen a different air taxi service because he'd wanted to surprise Luna. He hadn't realized he'd surprise George too. Excellent bonus. So what's going on here? I only caught the tail end, but it sounded as if you were threatening my manager. George adopted a regal stare. As the Trevelyan Pack Alpha, it's my job to police the Seattle War community. Luna is a disruptive influence. It's in everyone's best interest, including yours, for her to leave Seattle. Nice speech. Colin kept his voice and his gaze steady. Is that the same one you gave Sophie 28 years ago, or have you refined it since then? Luna gasped, but Colin didn't lose focus. This was a pitched battle between alphas, and maintaining eye contact was crucial. By doing that, he detected a slight flicker of an eyelid that told him George wasn't as calm as he feared. Yet George's reply was nonchalant. I haven't a clue what you're talking about. Then let me jog your memory. 28 years ago, a beautiful human female caught the attention of two Wer's cousins. In fact, the more competitive of the two was rejected in favor of the other. Rejection didn't sit well with him. He talked the woman into leaving by claiming that if she stayed, she'd ruin her chosen sweetheart's life. A muscle in George's cheek twitched. Nice try, but it didn't happen like that. Maybe not, but Edwina and Jacques remember that you took Sophie's rejection hard. They've always wondered why Sophie left so abruptly. One minute she was nuts about their son, something that did worry them, by the way. But then all at once she hopped on a train. You're lying. All the affability left George's expression. You haven't talked to them. Once I realized that it made no sense for Sophie to have left of her own accord when she was mated with Byron, I wondered who might have talked her into it. During a layover in Chicago, I phoned Edwina. George's eyes glittered. Edwina's losing it. You can't trust anything she says. Don't you say that about my grandmother. Luna started toward him. Colin put a restraining hand on her arm. He knows that's not true, Luna. He's bluffing, but it won't work. Edwina and I had a long conversation and we both agreed that if Byron had told anyone about mating with Sophie, it would have been his cousin, the Wer he loved like a brother. George's face turned gray. If I had any doubts about your role in this tragedy, Colin continued, your Actions today erase them. Luna's breath hissed out. You. The word was filled with equal parts of horror and loathing. Fingers curled, she lunged at George. Colin grabbed her around the waist and held on tight. Don't. He's not worth it. She struggled in his grip. But he's responsible for my father's death. He deserves to pay for that. Don't you think I pay for it every day of my cursed life? George's face twisted with agony. Oh, I'm so sorry for you. Luna's breathing was ragged. What about the price? My father paid. And my mother? And my grandparents? And me? How could I know he'd go after her? I told him she didn't love him anymore. That she didn't want to live as a were. Why didn't he believe me? If he'd believed me, he'd be alive. He came off Luna's body in waves. He didn't believe you because he knew she would always love him, that they were mated for all time. George began to shake. I get that now, but back then I didn't understand. Got the wreck, the blood. Burying his face in his hands, he wept. Colin had looked forward to this moment with relish, but now that it was here, he took no pleasure in George's complete humiliation. He just wanted the were out of his sight. I'll call Knox, he said. He'll take you home. God, no. George's shoulders quivered. I can't face my son right now. Luna stepped away from Colin, and he let her go. Although she might have been ready to claw George's eyes out a moment ago, Colin didn't think she'd do it. Now. She took a shaky breath. Sit down, George, she said. Get yourself together. His eyes red and his face damp with tears, George located the chair he'd recently vacated and sank unsteadily into it. He glanced once at Luna and looked away. Every time I see you, I see Sophie. That's why I wanted you gone. Luna folded her arms. Let's not forget the plan to buy Whittier House when my absence made Colin lose interest in the project. Don't pretend it was all about your guilt. George coughed. Okay, I admit that was a consideration. Reaching in his back pocket, he took out a handkerchief and began mopping his face. But now I'm finished. His whole body sagged. Once this gets out. Maybe it doesn't have to get out, Luna said. Colin glanced at her in surprise. Don't forget that I've talked to Edwina. And how did she react? She's upset. He directed his attention to George. And she expects you to atone for what you've done, which means clearing Sophie's name and welcoming Luna fully into the Trevelyan pack. However, once she finds out that you tried to drive her granddaughter out of town, she'll want my head on a platter, George said. Colin nodded. Yes, she will. And I'm prepared to hand it to her. Luna looked at Colin. But we don't have to tell her about this. Why wouldn't we? The bastard deserves whatever he gets. I agree, but think about it for a minute. Finally he understood her intention. Although she'd been put through an emotional ringer, she'd kept her wits about her. She was even smarter then. She was beautiful, and that was saying something. No, I guess we don't. George stared at both of them in amazement. You would do that? Yes, Luna said. On the condition that you throw all your support behind the Whittier House in without. Done. I'll do whatever you say. I'll wait. Luna held up her hand. I'm not finished. Colin and I welcome your support, but there can be no more discussion of buying in. We didn't want to be part of your empire before, and now we'd rather drink battery acid than be in business with a weasel like you. She looked at Colin. Right. Damn right. George blew out a breath and stood. Okay. He offered his hand first to Luna, and then to Colin. It's a deal. Colin shared a triumphant glance with Luna. He'd never been more proud of her, or more desperately in love. Luna held herself together until the helicopter lifted off the helipad, taking George Trevelyan back to Seattle. Wind from the whirling blades buffeted her as she stood next to Colin, who tucked his arm securely around her waist. As they watched the helicopter rise up over the trees, she allowed herself to lean into his solid warmth. That was intense. Thanks for showing up. He tightened his grip. I'm the one who should be thanking you. I was willing to let Edwina and the pack take him down, but thanks to your quick thinking, we have him right where we want him, on a tight leash. Yes, but y'all handed me the leash. Glancing up at his profile, she felt her heart constrict. He meant far more to her than he should under the circumstances. That insight about my mother was brilliant. I wish I'd thought of it. He turned, slid both arms around her waist, and gazed into her eyes. I can't take credit for the insight either. My brother Duncan came up with it. Then please thank him for me. I have a much better image of my mother now. She rested her hands on his broad shoulders and looked into his face. She never grew tired of doing that. And how is that situation with your brother? By the way, he's breaking up with Molly. And you're happy about that, I'll bet. So Colin had efficiently subdued his brother's rebellious impulse. She felt a prick of disappointment. Colin's prejudices were still firmly in place. I'm happy only because she wasn't his true mate. You're absolutely sure she's not? He's sure, and that's what counts. She nodded, but she wondered if Duncan had simply caved under pressure and told his older brother what he wanted to hear. Colin could be extremely convincing, as she knew firsthand. He started to say something, then shook his head and glanced away. What? He looked into her eyes. I wish you'd called me when you knew George was coming. I understand why you didn't, but I still wish you'd called to let me know. I wasn't about to bother y'all when I didn't know what he wanted. This Laird of Glenbarra had a lot of nerve, but then he was a pack alpha, so it probably went with the job. Speaking of calling, I wish you'd called me to say you were flying back here, and I don't understand that at all. Why the hell didn't you? I wanted to surprise you. Mission accomplished. I thought I was hallucinating. You had no reason to be here. He pulled her closer, surrounding her with his heat, his scent, his charisma. I had every reason to be here. His gaze searched hers. I've been an idiot. Luna, I hope someday you'll forgive me. For what? Something in his expression was different, and he'd never called himself an idiot before. That wasn't particularly Laird-like. She wondered what he was leading up to. Then a horrible possibility occurred to her. Please tell me y'all didn't sell Whittier House. No, I wouldn't do that. She let out a breath. For a second there I was really scared. So what am I supposed to forgive then? My arrogance, my meddling, my stubbornness, my insufferable snobbishness. Oh. She paused while she debated whether to be honest or not. Honesty won out. I have to admit you're guilty of those things, but I just don't reject me yet. His plea was reflected in his amazing blue eyes. I know I have flaws, but give me a chance to redeem myself. There's no rejection going on. Y'all and your flaws are still welcome in my bed anytime. He reached up and cupped her face in his hand. And that makes me a very lucky chap indeed. He stroked her cheek with his thumb. But I want more than that, lass. More. She blinked in confusion. Look, I'm not into bondage. He smiled. Neither am I. Then what is it y'all want? His smile faded and his gaze intensified. A mate, Luna. Her body vibrated as if she touched a bare electrical wire. She opened her mouth to speak, but nothing came out. A mate? She must have misunderstood. He took her face in both hands and looked into her eyes. I know why you're confused. I've done a fine job of convincing you we don't belong together. So, now I have to convince you that we do. Let's start with this. He lowered his mouth to hers. As a persuasive technique, it worked like a charm. After a few seconds of the loveliest kiss he'd ever given her, she was willing to believe anything he said. He ended the kiss slowly and raised his head. His smile was heartbreakingly tender. I love you, and I mean to reform so that you'll love me back. But I already do. She clutched his shoulders and prayed this wasn't a dream. But he felt very real. His eyes filled with joy. I can't imagine why that's so, but I'd be a bloody fool to question it. He started to kiss her again. Wait, what about Scotland? Scotland? You're the much-honored Laird of Glenbarra. So I am. And I may need to make regular trips there, even if Duncan takes on more responsibility for the place. But I won't ask you to leave the island. Know how much it means to you. She wrapped her arms around his neck. Just try leaving without me, mister. You'd want to go? Providing y'all would want me there. Belatedly she realized she might not be totally welcome. I do. I'll be proud to introduce you as my mate and the Lady of Glenbarra. But I won't be the one they would have chosen. No, his expression hopeful, he met her gaze. At least not at first. But if you're willing to make trips over there, we could work together to open some minds, and that would be a good thing. I realize I'm asking a lot of you. But I'm up to it. As she said that, she knew it was true. She no longer needed constant contact with this island. It could serve as her base as she helped her newly tolerant mate spread even more tolerance in his homeland. Y'all once told me I might be destined for more than a secluded life on La Florette. And so you are, my lady. His lips hovered over hers. My lady. I like the sound of that. I'm glad. He brushed her lips with his. Think of it. I'm going to have a Scottish title. He lifted his head and grinned at her. If I'd known you'd be so taken with the idea, I would have started with that instead of listing all my failings. What failings? He laughed. Now lass, I'm not perfect and you well know it. Y'all are perfect for me. And to prove it, she pulled him down for the steamiest kiss in her short but extremely eventful kissing history. Epilogue. Opening weekend at the Whittier Inn could have turned into a disaster, but Colin had agreed with Luna that they should invite all the major players, including her grandparents and as many of the Trevelyan pack as could make it, including George. On top of that, Colin had decided to go for broke and invite Duncan and his mother, Bridget. His father was too ill to make the trip, but Duncan and his mother had arrived, right on schedule, eager to meet the half-breed where Colin had claimed as his mate. He'd told his mother everything and had let her decide how much to tell his father. He suspected she hadn't revealed much, but none of that mattered on this bright August day as the guests gathered outside for the croquet tournament Luna had organized as an icebreaker. Colin stayed in the background, content to watch his lady shine. And shine she did, moving through the crowd in her bright flowered dress. Guests, including his mother and brother, buzzed around her like bees seeking nectar. Colin understood. He wanted to do the same, but he resisted the urge. Later tonight he would have his turn. He could wait. Hector, looking sporty in a polo shirt and crisp navy slacks, sauntered over to where Colin stood. So she talked you into wearing your kilt, I see. Aye. Colin didn't add that Luna could talk him into anything at all. Hector probably knew that already. Thank you for agreeing to mingle with the guests. I know it's not your favorite thing to do. Hector chuckled. It seems to mean a lot to her. And it's not so bad. In fact, it's good to see how some of those boys turned out. Hors d'oeuvres, gentlemen. Dulcie, dressed in a sequin top and tight white pants, appeared bearing a tray of bite-sized delicacies Janet had spent the afternoon creating. Thanks, Dulcie. Colin picked up a still warm pastry that oozed fragrant cheese. Hector helped himself to a cracker with a swirled topping. Don't mind if I do. Then he reached down with his free hand and pinched Dulcie's bottom. Hector, you old reprobate. Dulcie pretended outrage, but her color was high, and her eyes sparkled. Catch you later, Dulce. Hector winked at her. Only if you're fast enough, heck. She walked away, hips swaying. I'll pretend I didn't see that, Colin said. Hell, at my age I don't care who sees it. I'm just grateful that I still have lead in my pencil. Colin almost choked on his cheese-filled pastry. Don't hurt yourself, son. Right. Colin swallowed the last of the pastry and wiped the moisture from his eyes. By the way, I'm also grateful that you and Luna haven't instituted any rules against fraternizing among the staff members. Would it matter if we did? Hector shrugged. Not really. We just get sneaky about it. That's what I thought. The dynamic around here is better now that Dulcie and I have something going. Sexual frustration makes folks cranky. I do believe I suffered from that problem a bit, although I doubt anyone noticed. I doubt they did. Colin controlled the urge to laugh. The rest of the staff was overjoyed that prickly Hector had been replaced by mellow Hector. Dulcie seemed quite happy with the turn of events, too. It's all coming together, Hector said. Sybil's ready to take over temporarily when you and Luna are in Scotland, and Janet gets a kick out of bossing her new recruits in the kitchen. He paused. Geraldine would have loved this. Luna walked over, smiling as she approached. What would Geraldine have loved? All of it. Hector swept an arm to encompass a landscape filled with cheerful guests against a backdrop of green grass, flowers, the bright sea, and a magnificent castle. She intended to fill this place with family, and when that didn't happen, I don't think she knew how to correct the situation. He gazed at Luna. But you did. Luna flushed with obvious pleasure. Thank the Laird of Glenbarra for taking a chance on me. Colin knew an opening when he heard one. Walking toward her, He held out his hand. And I want to thank the Lady of Glenbarra for taking an even bigger chance. He drew her close. On me. Ah, go ahead and kiss her, Hector said. It'll do you both good. I believe it will, at that. Leaning down, Colin savored the sweetness of Luna's mouth for as long as he dared. Then he drew back. Later, lass. With a knowing smile, she returned to her guests. See. Hector gave him a sly wink. Nice to know you have lead in your pencil. Isn't it? Yes. Colin willed his erection to subside. Except when you're wearing a bloody kilt. Hector's laughter was contagious, and soon Colin was laughing with him. Yet, he thought Geraldine would have loved this.